In 2017, the United States Army concluded a $580 million competition to find a new service pistol. They spent years testing designs, firing hundreds of thousands of rounds, and ultimately awarded the massive contract to Sig Sauer. But the military's most elite units weren't waiting for the results. They were carrying something else entirely. Navy SEALs, Green Berets, and Marine Raiders had already standardized around the Glock 19. It was a compact, lightweight sidearm originally designed decades earlier by an Austrian man whose primary business was manufacturing curtain rods. To understand why the military's top tiers broke away, you have to look at what the Army had been issuing since 1985, the Beretta M9. It was built around a heavy metal frame, weighing over 2 pounds unloaded. It featured a complex double-action and single-action trigger system, meaning a soldier had to manage 2 completely different trigger pull weights under stress. For a conventional soldier carrying a sidearm and a flap holster as a backup, those specifications were adequate. But for a 12-man special operations team conducting direct-action night raids, a heavy, bulky pistol creates a distinct operational liability. They needed a tool the standard procurement pipeline was failing to provide. These operators frequently run missions where discretion is a baseline requirement. They move through tight spaces and unfamiliar environments, conduct surveillance, and advise partner forces while wearing civilian clothes. In these environments, flashing a full-size U.S. military sidearm instantly identifies the wearer and jeopardizes the operation. When you're already carrying a rifle, body armor, medical equipment, and specialized tools, reducing loadout weight is critical. Shaving off 10 ounces and adopting a highly concealable profile transitions a sidearm from a cumbersome afterthought into a viable primary weapon for close-quarters work. But getting a different gun wasn't simple. Submitting an official request to replace a primary military handgun triggers a sprawling administrative machine. It requires years of congressional budget reviews, logistical compatibility studies, and multi-agency testing that delays any immediate deployment of new gear. Elite units recognized that fighting this sprawling bureaucracy head-on would leave them waiting years for equipment they needed on their next deployment. If they wanted a functional weapon, they had to bypass the official channels and find a quiet administrative workaround. The solution came from an unlikely source. In the early 1980s, Gaston Glock was running a small machine shop outside Vienna. He had zero experience in firearms engineering. His background was in material science, specifically high-strength synthetic polymers. When the Austrian military put out a call for a new service pistol, Glock consulted shooting experts and designed a prototype in just 3 months. By using a nylon composite instead of steel, he dramatically cut the weapon's weight. He also stripped down the mechanics, reducing the entire assembly to approximately 35 parts. His design relied entirely on internal, automatic safeties. There were no external levers to flip down, and no double-action mechanics. One consistent trigger pull released the firing pin, every single time. It eliminated the need for operators to train around a complex manual of arms under adrenal stress. By the early 2000s, this simplified platform caught the attention of Delta Force. Operating under Joint Special Operations Command, Delta had the unique procurement latitude to bypass conventional Army limits. They quietly acquired Glock 22s chambered in .4 caliber. The rest of the Special Forces community immediately took notice. Unburdened by decades of traditional gunsmithing assumptions, a plastics manufacturer had built exactly what modern combat operators were looking for. And once one of the most selective units adopted it, intense ground-level demand for the Glock rapidly spread across every elite team. Getting Glocks into standard Special Forces armories required a highly calculated bureaucratic maneuver. The operators knew that submitting paperwork to replace the Beretta M9 would force a massive competition, so they simply never asked for a replacement. Instead, they identified a specific operational gap. They submitted a requirement for a compact handgun for civilian close operations. This surgical wording required a compact profile for concealment, which legally disqualified full-size military sidearms. The criteria mapped perfectly onto the Glock 19. Approved as a supplementary item for specialized missions, the new pistols began appearing in Special Forces inventories by late 2006. Deploying teams carried them overseas, while stateside units retained the M9. The Army's overarching procurement rules were completely sidestepped. The Glock 19 bypassed a $500 million testing apparatus entirely. It achieved widespread elite adoption by exploiting a tiny administrative gap, using a single, carefully weaponized sentence to deliver exactly what the operators needed. As the pistol's influence expanded globally, its inventor faced his own extreme stress test. In July 1999, an associate embezzling from the company hired a former professional wrestler to assassinate a 70-year-old Gaston Glock in a Luxembourg parking garage. The weapon of choice was a rubber mallet. Glock fought back hard enough to thwart the hitman. He survived the ambush, saw his attackers convicted, and maintained absolute control over his rapidly expanding manufacturing empire. By 2017, that empire decided to pursue the Army's official modular handgun system competition. To meet the military's rigid requirements, Glock had to contradict its own founding design principles. They built a modified version featuring an external manual thumb safety, specifically to satisfy the evaluation committee. It didn't work. The Army passed on the compromised design, awarding the highly publicized contract to Sig Sauer. But a formal procurement rejection matters very little when your hardware has already quietly conquered the ranks of the people actually pulling the trigger. Before the Army even announced its winner, Special Operations Command had already purchased enough Glock 19s to supply every soldier in U.S. Army Special Forces. A decade of combat data in Iraq, Afghanistan, and beyond proved the platform's reliability, prompting SOCOM to standardize the weapon across all its branches. The civilian sector followed a nearly identical trajectory. The FBI adopted a Glock 19 variant around the same time, driving a massive surge in police contracts. Soon, nearly 2/3 of American law enforcement agencies were issuing the platform to their officers. This creates a self-reinforcing loop. When recruits, civilian shooters, and operators all master the same system, the platform matures into permanent institutional infrastructure. It locks into training pipelines and muscle memory until the hardware becomes nearly impossible to replace. The Army spent years asking what single weapon could replace its standard issue across hundreds of thousands of troops. Special Operations simply asked what tool could solve a highly specific gap in their deployment capabilities. The defining tactical sidearm of the modern era didn't achieve its status by winning a heavily publicized committee vote. It took over because a few operators knew exactly what problem they needed to solve and quietly pushed the answer through a side door in the system.